to Podcasts on Demand, a continuing medical education activity. This activity includes the most recent and current clinical data presented by leading experts. If you are seeking continuing education credit, please review the disclosures and the requirements for successful completion of the activity prior to listening to the podcast. A link is found in the podcast description that can direct you to this information.
Hi, this is Dr. Paul Sachs, Clinical Director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And welcome to Clinical Clips from the 2024 Munich AIDS Conference. Today's day 3 of 4, and happy birthday, happy 90th birthday to my mother, if she happens to be interested in getting the latest news from Munich. So there was an interesting afternoon session today on new antiretroviral agents. And I'm going to start with a clinical trial, a phase 2 clinical trial called Artistry-1, which basically is looking at the combination of bictegravir and lenacapavir. And this combination in this study was given as separate pills. Actually, the lenacapavir was given in 2 different doses. And the bictegravir, interestingly, was given as a 75 milligram dose, which gives comparable exposure to 50 milligrams when it's combined with TAF-FTC, which is how we usually give it. And the study population of interest were people taking complex antiretroviral regimens, which is variously defined in the protocol. But just to give you an idea of the kind of regimens they were taking, this is an older patient population who'd been on an ART for many years. Most of them had some degree of background resistance. That's why they were taking a complex regimen. 27 years median of treatment. That's like a world record. Lots of comorbidities. And interestingly, if you looked at the number of pills they took, over a quarter of them were taking 5 or more pills a day. So the goal was to see if they could simplify their regimen to just bictegravir, lenacapavir, 2 different doses, and they compared that to continuing the background regimen. And 48-week results were discussed, and the 48-week results showed that a little over 90% of those in the bictegravir lenacapavir arms maintained suppression versus 100% in the background regimen, in the baseline regimen strategy. And this is not statistically significant, but remember, it's a phase 2 study and the sample size was small. Since the regimen was well tolerated, there are plans now to go forward with a co-formulated version of the bictegravir lenacapavir combination, 75 milligrams bictegravir, 50 milligrams of lenacapavir, once daily orally, and that is a fully powered study, and look forward to seeing the results of that in the future. The second study is actually a much earlier kind of trial. This is earlier in development, and it's a integrase inhibitor called VH184, which the presenter described as the next generation integrase inhibitor, 3rd generation integrase inhibitor. And whenever someone mentions these generations, I always think of cephalosporins, but what they really mean here is resistance, is that they have activity against integrase inhibitor resistant viruses. So the first phase of the study presented was just, first in humans, demonstrating that it seems to be well tolerated. These are in people who are HIV negative. And also they did some probes for drug interactions and didn't seem to find any CYP3A4 interactions using midazolam. In addition, they gave it with and without food and found it had a moderate food effect, which in general doesn't require taking it with or without food. So that's good news. But probably the more interesting part for those of us who sort of nerd out on this resistance stuff is that they took clinical isolates from the Dawning and the Sailing studies. Those were studies looking at dolutegravir and raltegravir, respectively, in treatment-experienced patients. And in patients who were in those studies who developed resistance to the integrase inhibitors, they then tested this new VH184 in vitro against these isolates, and they found that it maintained very potent activity across a wide range of highly resistant viruses. And why is that important? Well, it's important because as we know, with more and more dolutegravir being used globally, there is an increased incidence of integrase inhibitor resistance. It's inevitable. Over 20 million people on dolutegravir is going to be more resistance, and it's good to have something like this under investigation. The third study I wanted to discuss is not really new drugs at all, but it's a new population. And that's the first study that looks at injectable cabotegravir in adolescents. This is a combination that, of course, has been approved in adults, but it doesn't have enough data in adolescents for approval. But it's a population that's very important because they often struggle with poor adherence and stigma and all the other things that often drive people to want injectable therapy. And this is a global study. There are 18 IMPACT, that's the name of the Trials Network, sites around the globe in practically every continent except Australia and Antarctica. And what they did was they took the cabotegravir ropivirine in virologically suppressed adolescents. There are 144 of them, median age of 15. Over 90% had perinatal HIV infections, so they'd been taking oral ART for a long time, their whole life, essentially. And then they gave them injectable cabotegravir ropivirine at standard doses after an oral lead-in, and it was overall highly successful. It ended up leading to high rates of virologic suppression. And not only that, importantly, every participant was asked, do you want to go back on oral therapy or do you want to continue the injectable? And everyone chose continuing the injectable. So this is a population that's really understudied. So I hope that they can gain access to this treatment in the future, especially in countries, in parts of the world like sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the pediatric HIV is now occurring. Switching now to a more regular HIV treatment, not new treatment, and that's dolutegravir lamivudine versus bictegravir FTC TAF. This is the first of two such studies at this conference. This is called the DIAD study, and it's important because it's our two most commonly used regimens. Patients who are stable on bictegravir FTC TAF were then randomized to continue it or to switch to dolutegravir lamivudine in a 2-to-1 ratio. And the week 48 results were presented. And just to cut to the chase, virologic suppression was similar in both of them. There were more discontinuations in the dolutegravir lamivudine arm, but that could be because of the open label nature of the study and something called ascertainment bias, which is that when people are switched to a new regimen, they often blame any side effect on that new regimen. Obviously, they excluded people who had chronic hepatitis B or had any NRTI resistance. That would be an interesting future study. And they did find that there was little difference in metabolic parameters. There was slightly more weight reduction in the dolutegravir lamivudine arm, but it was not statistically significant. But stay tuned for tomorrow's discussion about the Paso Doble study. And the last thing I wanted to mention was just a fascinating report from India on a topic that comes up periodically in our clinics, only the numbers here are quite large. And that's the study, that's a longitudinal study of HIV elite controllers, people, virologic controllers who maintain viral suppression without any ART. And this looked from 2001 to 2023 in Mumbai. And out of 4,030 treatment-naive people in that clinic population, ultimately they found 36 HIV controllers who had at least 5 years of follow-up. And I think the demographics are very interesting. First, there was an interesting high proportion who had HIV-2 also. 4 out of the group had HIV-2 co-infection. In addition, there were more women than men, 78% women, 22% men. Also interesting is that a bunch of them had vertical HIV acquisition, meaning they got it at the time of birth. There were some who did have to go on ART during the course of the follow-up, 2 for pregnancy, 1 for viremia. They lost virologic control, 1 for a person who developed an immune-mediated complication, that's ITP, and then 1 who developed pulmonary tuberculosis. Although given the high incidence of pulmonary TB in India, it could be not HIV-related. It's just a fascinating observation and showing that in this context where we don't always know if ART is required, long-term follow-up can give us some very important information. So that comes to the end of today's clinical clips. Please go to the landing page for slides and to claim your continuing education credit. Please be sure to come back tomorrow for our final clip from the AIDS 2024 conference here in Munich. And once again, happy birthday, Mom.
We hope you found this podcast useful and educational. To receive continuing education credit and to download your printable certificate, please go to the activity page at practice.cme.com to complete the post-test and evaluation to receive continuing education credit.